Andy, it's a huge welcome to you to the Sales Transformation Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor.
Well, it's an honor for us, Andy, and I know that our head of marketing, Eddie, is a great fan of yours and has been following your blogs over the month. So we're delighted that we have you here now in person. What we tend to do with the podcast is we tend to start with your doing a short introduction of yourself, if that's okay, so that the listeners can get some sort of picture of who Andy is. And I wonder if I could ask you to just run through a little bit your background and also the journey that you've taken to have got to this point in time with the strategic narrative.
So I work with CEOs on what I call the strategic narrative, which I'll define as this sort of single story that we use when pitching the company to potential customers, investors, job candidates, media, pretty much everyone. And this story powers success in sales, fundraising, marketing, recruiting, kind of everything. How I got started with this is a little bit of a story. So I started as a computer science major in college. I was a coder coming out of school. And a few years after that, a friend and I had an idea for an app. And we coded a prototype. This was like .com years. So this was a Windows app. We coded a prototype and started getting some users. And we thought, okay, maybe this could be a business. So we decided to pitch VCs, and of the two of us, I spoke English fluently. So we decided I was the best qualified to write the pitch. So I wrote the pitch and we sent it to a bunch of VCs, and the reaction was really bad. And one of them wrote back, Andy, listen, I rate every plan I get on a scale of 1 to 10, and yours is a 1. And then in parentheses, he wrote worst, in case we thought maybe 1 was the top of his scale. No.
That's pretty shocking feedback, isn't it? Pretty shocking.
It was devastating.
It must have been, yeah.
And so devastating that he wrote this little comment. This was back when you would mail the hard copy plan to the investor. And he sent it back and he wrote in the margin, not a compelling story. And we were so devastated, we didn't really pay much attention to this. But a few weeks later, I was walking by this Barnes & Noble bookstore, and there was a sign in the window that said, for anyone who wants to tell a compelling story. So that's me. Mm-hmm. And there's an arrow to these books. And I go inside, and it turns out these books are about screenwriting. And I had no idea about that subject. It was not something I had any experience with. But so I read these books. And aside from learning a lot about sort of how a screenplay is structured, it was an invitation to think about a pitch about a movie as a pitch. What is Star Wars a pitch for? It's a pitch for, being good to people and, caring about people, trusting the Force in Star Wars language. Of course, as an entrepreneur or hopeful one, I didn't have 2 hours and I didn't have actors and special effects. So what applied to me, what didn't apply to me, these were very difficult questions to answer, and that I've been thinking about for like the last basically 25 years. But I did my best, and we rewrote the plan and incorporated some of this knowledge, and we started getting interest, and we had a term sheet a few months later. And I think it was not coincidental. And so anyway, other CEOs started hearing about this. Eventually, I started a practice around helping others craft a story like this. And I've been doing that for about 10 years.
So from 25 years ago to 10 years ago, were you still in the sort of technology, sort of coding, app development kind of field?
Well, Phil, you're asking to get into the my career path, which is an incredibly difficult thing for anybody to understand, let alone me. But I'll do the best.
Is there a light version?
It's so heavy and hard. But Yeah, I'll give you the light version. So I actually took a little detour for about 6 or 7 years and was a journalist. So I got this
Ah,
I got so
okay.
interested in this story structure stuff. I started pitching articles to magazines, and I started writing. And then I was a full time journalist at a magazine called Business 2.0, which was part of Time Inc. It was like a sister publication to Fortune. Uh,
Yeah.
I eventually got the bug to kind of get back, and I worked as a product manager at Skype. Uh, and
Okay.
it was at Skype where I started to see that this training I now had as a journalist uh, had some real relevance to like the kind of messaging of the company and how we talked about things. And
Hmm.
that led me to some marketing roles, first at Skype, and then later at a company called Mashery, which was an early platform for API management. So we were selling
Okay.
APIs before anybody really, knew what they were or was willing to
Mm.
bring them up in polite conversation. So it was hard to, how do you tell that story? So I started to see that a lot of this stuff was relevant, and it was actually the CEO of Mashery, who his name is Orrin Michaels, who started to make that connection with me and really helped me get on the path to starting this practice.
Actually, I think that I'm so glad I asked the question because yes, I was trying to sort of link, sort of where you've come from to what you're doing now, and the journalist kind of phase that you had, I could see was quite an important part of the journey that you've been on. Sort of focusing on I guess is it mainly the written word that you are, or is it also the spoken narrative? I mean, I'm not sure now where your practice takes you, or whether there's a link between the two.
Well, you bring up a really interesting question, which is like, in what form should we kind of capture this narrative so that we can tell it, so that it functions across all these ways that I talked about: sales, of course, marketing, product, and in sometimes it's just going to be someone talking, and sometimes we might be able to show slides or have to tell it in
Hmm.
paragraphs on a website. And the traditional answer to this question is, let's write down some sort of like boilerplate thing that's internal in the company that no one outside ever sees. So it's some sort of internal thing. Often marketers call it like a messaging house or something, where there's like fragments of messages. Like, here's our top message, here's our supporting messages, here, blah, blah, blah. And the idea of this thing is everybody, whether they're going to talk or write or whatever, they're going to come back to this thing and pull messages from it. And I found that would break down in my career in two big ways. One, a lot of people didn't come back to it, especially outside of marketing, where it was often kept. And the second thing was that often, even if they did, it was hard for a lot of people to take these fragments of messages and weave them into whatever, talk or writing they were trying to do. So I thought really hard about this and experimented a lot. And I came to the asset that I came to that worked the best as the kind of unifying thing for the narrative was the sales deck. The sales
Hmm.
deck, the sales pitch as the unifying thing. Like, if we can write it down in this sort of simple way that works in a sales goal, that is the thing that everybody can use to talk to everybody. And this is a controversial position. I mean, most people think of the sales deck as an output of some more fundamental, I don't know, strategic thing. And I started to say, no, the sales deck is the fundamental strategic thing.
Mm. So I really uh, just enjoying the way this conversation is going, and I there's a couple of things that you prompted sort of distant memories, actually, Andy. But I remember coming across a program that was quite successful in the 1980s, which was around an organization called, I think, the Science of Selling. And it was really, starting with product, and it was sort of working at product marketing and marketing communications. And it then looked at features of the product and the advantages of the product. And then it would look at the silver bullets and, what were the killer aspects of this product that would perhaps be sold. It involved competitive analysis, all sorts of quite, it's quite a big machine to run this, because you are engaging sort of product marketing, and eventually you come up with this sort of playbook, I suppose, for sales. And it was pretty impressive. It was in the sense that it was highly engineered. It was very process orientated. And of course, very few people got to use it properly. They got, it didn't get used. So the comment that you made earlier about how often these messages sit somewhere in an organization and they're not used, I think, I sort of can resonate with.
I think that story brings up what I find interesting about that story. It's not only a process that I find doesn't work, which is, hey, we're going to build this story in marketing and push it on sales. But also, you said, the starting point of this is like, what's our features and our magic bullet or something, or silver bullet, I think you called it. Yeah. And what I learned from the screenwriting books was to flip it completely on its head. And the starting point is not the product. The starting point in every strategic narrative that I build with teams is what I call the shift in the world. So, every movie starts with some big event. So sometimes it's, in the epic movies, there's often some big challenge or something evil often shows up, Darth Vader or something. But in it doesn't have to be an evil. Sometimes in like a love story, it's, the meet cute happens, like this big event happens, and it just changes the game for the main character. Like whatever they were doing before, like suddenly all these new, it's like a new world now. And I started to see, starting with like Benioff at Salesforce. And I think you and I might be old enough to remember when this was, when he actually came up with this. Maybe a lot of listeners don't, but, he doesn't pitch like, hey, you have a problem, or, that classic structure of, you have a problem, I have a solution, and here's why it's the best. He starts with this completely other thing, which is, hey, software is over. And of course, software in the way he means it, in software that we're going to own and operate ourselves. And there's this new world called the cloud. This is the structure I call old game, new game. So he's defining the world as a shift from an old game of software to a new game of cloud. Same thing with Zuora, which is a company I've written a lot about. Yeah. They say, hey, used to be we'd sell things to people. Now people want to subscribe to things and get the benefits of the assets without actually owning them. And these pitches are not starting out with like, hey, you have a problem, here's our silver bullets. They're starting out with, hey, here's how your world has just totally changed. And of course, now that's going to lead into how you're going to have to adapt.
Mm. That's it. I mean, in both the examples you've given, there's sort of, the shift is to the sort of digital sort of cloud world. But is it possible, if you're not in that sort of software environment, to be able to create a narrative around a shift?
So far, every time I've worked with a team, we've been able to come up with one that feels really good. I'll give you some other examples that are different. Yeah. So I recently worked with a team called 360 Learning. I think their headquarters are officially in France, but in New York, but they're, I think, founded in France. And so 360 Learning tells a story about how, so they make training software, but their focus of the training software is all about the company creating getting people in the company to create their own courses and become kind of teachers. And so they talk about the shift from like top-down learning, where some, L&D leader decides what everyone's going to learn and like hires some outside person to create the courses,
Mhm.
to what 360 Learning calls collaborative learning, and where they define it as upskill from within, where we're going to create
Mhm.
and they're showing that, hey, look, all the best organizations, if you look at like uh, Tesla, Google, they're all like sort of turning their internal people into trainers and kind of expert stars. And,
Mhm.
that's the new way to win. This kind of upskill from within. So, you can do this. It doesn't have to be about a technical shift. In fact, I think
Yeah.
in a way, it's better if it's not. And transactions to subscriptions, yes, it's enabled by technical shifts, but it's not about a technical shift on the face of it.
Mhm. I mean, it's interesting. We'll go into sort of more detail. I think the sort of steps of the process, perhaps you might sort of look at. But so many organisations are kind of structured around product kind of silos, where the P&L is driven by the head of that product division, and that influences so much of what they do from a marketing point of view and from a sales point of view. And I would imagine that sort of challenged, with perhaps there's a different way, to go out and sell that may not be quite so product specific, but around a strategic narrative that it's not so much about feeds and speeds and all of
Well,
those things.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not about feeds and speeds, because feeds and
Yeah.
speeds are very, very important. Or,
Okay.
of course, whatever your version of that is.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is this narrative is how we set up why these feeds and speeds matter.
Okay.
So, the typical approach is this, hey, you have a problem. I have the solution. Let me tell you why it's the best solution. This is what I call the arrogant doctor. You have a you have a
Mm-hmm.
pain. I have a treatment. Let me tell you why it's the best treatment. Um, this is fine if the buyer totally understands sort of what's at stake here,
Yeah.
which is typically like very early adopters. They kind of understand. They already know the narrative pretty much, right? Um, the where it, I think, falls or for short is where the significance of your advantage in speeds and feeds or features, whatever we want to call it,
Yeah.
is it's not immediately obvious to everybody why that matters. And this is especially important when we're selling to big organizations, where a lot of the people involved in the purchase are, not the person who's the user. They might
Yeah.
be a C-level person or whatever, and we need to arm the buyer team, the actual user who's needing support within their company to do the purchase, who needs championing to be that champion, and arm them with the narrative to do that.
Yeah. So so interesting. So so you're leveraging your sort of journalistic skills coupled with your personal experience of pitches that haven't worked but then have worked, um, in helping organizations create a strategic narrative which is in the form of a sales deck, as you've described earlier, which will help position the organization to sort of customers that they're selling to. Have I simplified it too much, or is that kind of roughly where we're at?
Yeah. And I would say not just customers though, but people we're recruiting,
Internal.
investors,
Okay.
everybody.
Onboarding of, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Sure.
So, in terms of the journey that you take people on, in terms of defining what that strategic narrative is, could you talk us through what you would typically do, and how do you get to those, I guess, few words that describes everything about that company that you want to communicate?
Yeah. Well, The first thing, one of my biggest learnings was that even though we're talking about the sales pitch as this kind of core narrative asset that we're going to build, it has to be the CEO who is leading this work. And by leading, I don't mean just like they signed off on the budget or they're going to, sign off on some result. Literally, they are the person who is in the room with me for hours and hours. Well, these days it's on a Zoom call with me for hours and hours and hours, crafting this story, this pitch, refining it. Of course, we also want, though, a strong leadership team buy-in. So I always ask the CEO to name a small team of leaders, typically from marketing, sales, obviously, product. Sometimes there's like a co-founder or COO kind of person. Basically, have them create a small team that is going to guide the work. So it's a back and forth of the CEO and I building like drafts, bringing it to the team. They tell us they hate it. Usually the first time that we bring it to the team. So I actually do a kickoff session where I go through the pieces of the strategic narrative, and I can go through them with you if you want. We go through sort of these like 5 pieces roughly, and I ask for the ideas.
Could you
of
talk
all
us
these.
through the?
I will.
The 5. Oh, you will do.
But,
okay.
But I ask the team for like, okay, can you give me, what do you think we should say for these different various pieces?
Okay.
And you can imagine we come out of this session with like boards and boards of notes and ideas. And so then the CEO and I go off and we start building this, thing based on the field. And in order to come up with something, kind of, short enough and powerful enough, the CEO is going to basically have to throw out almost everything that the team has given. By the way, I also have them do customer interviews that become inputs to this. But the CEO is going to have to throw out even almost most of that, and just pick out these big kind of nuggets. And so when we present it to the team, there's always that first presentation. I always warn them. This is going to be the low point of our work together, because the team is sort of given their gold ideas and now they're seeing it come back and there's where's my gold idea? The good news is the team gets to weigh in on what's working and not working. And that feedback loop then creates something where usually after about one more session of me and the CEO, about one more week of me and the CEO working on it, we can bring it back and there's enough alignment to move on. You asked about the 5 pieces. Well, I mentioned them and then you asked me to elaborate on them. Well, the first one really is this change in the world, this shift in the world that I talked about, that old game, new game setup. So I just asked the team, okay, I show them some examples, like some of the ones I talked about with you just earlier. And I say, hey, what is that for us? And, there are some kind of guidelines or principles I've learned that sort of help us get to a good one. So for instance, it's usually good if the old game was not like on the face of it really dumb. Like, transaction. Let's take the Zora one, transactions. You weren't dumb to be doing transactions, right? That was the way that you won. That used to be the winning game. Sometimes people say things like, hey, the old game was you never had any data and you made bad decisions. And the new game is you're going to make great decisions. Nobody ever set out to play an old game called I don't have any data and I make bad decisions. An example that's kind of like that goes to a better place is one that Gong, that came out of my work with Gong, which they talk about goodbye opinions, hello reality. It used to be we kind of ran sales on opinions. I think a lot of people will say, yeah, I used to do that. And then now, we're going to run it based on this reality view. The next piece is, okay, we've talked about this shift in the world. How does this creating life and death stakes for the buyer. So again, this draws on the movie. The often the main character is kind of called to action and refuses. It's what Joseph Campbell, the great narrative theorist, called refusal of the call. So, when in Star Wars, when Obi-Wan shows up, sorry if the spoilers, anyone, Obi-Wan shows up and he asks Luke, hey, you want to go out into space and have adventures and all this, be a pilot. And Luke has been belly aching about this the whole time. What does Luke say? He actually says, I kind of got to get home. That sounds a little dangerous. So what makes Luke go, it's when the Empire, kills his aunt and uncle. And now it's kind of implied they're kind of coming for him or for his droids. And so the stakes are now life and death for him.
Mm-hmm.
So Zuora, when they talk about this shift from, transactions to subscriptions, they're not only saying, hey, that's happening. They're saying, hey, look what's happening. All the new winning companies like Airbnb, and this was back in 2015 when this was a new story, but Airbnb and Box.com and Uber, these are all subscription or subscription-like companies. The person's not buying the thing; they're renting it in some way.
Yeah.
Look at all the the losers. They're all out of business. Anyone who was selling some, the Blockbusters, whatever. Anyway, so they're showing that there's this life and death thing, and there's many ways to do that. But anyway, we try to see if we can come up with one. The next piece is what I call the buyer mission statement. So we're presenting this new game to the buyer, saying, "Hey, the world has changed. In the movie, it's usually very clear, very quickly, like what the main character has to do to win. So in Star Wars, within like the first 15 minutes, we know, okay, you got to destroy this Death Star thing, and that's going to be it. And same with Zuora, they say, hey, you're basically going to have to deliver what we call the subscription experience, and they define this in different ways. And it's gonna, I don't want to get into it, but okay, that's the goal state. Mm-hmm. And so, what is this goal state? So I mentioned with 360 learning, we're having this shift from top-down learning to collaborative learning. The goal state, upskill from within. So can we come up with this phrase? And you can imagine this phrase often does work very well, like at the top of a website, or, we have to sum it all up. The last two pieces then are, okay, so what are the obstacles to getting to that goal state? So again, in the movies, he can't just go destroy the Death Star. There's lots of, obstacles along the way. It's going to be the same thing. Obviously, if the buyer could just get to that end point easily, no need for you and your great product and its silver bullets. So what are the big challenges? And of course, these are challenges that existing solutions are not going to handle. And then of course, we're then going to come and talk about the capabilities we have. Now we can talk about the silver bullets because it's really clear now why they matter.
Sure.
And we can talk about, what we do. And of course, along with that, proof, like success stories and things like that.
Yeah. So I would say that that one of the skills you must have is to be able to synthesize lots of conversation and data, I suppose, may not be data, but conversations into finding out against these 5 different stages, or perhaps it's just the first few, those very short statements that somehow describe what the future is going to look like. I just think that, not everyone can do that kind of stuff.
I actually don't try to sell that ability because sometimes I get it. Sometimes it comes from someone else, someone else on the team. And one of the things I learned when I was a CEO, so we got the money from that company, from that pitch, and we I led a small startup for a while, was how to run a meeting and get feedback from people, which
Yeah.
It was one of the most valuable things I ever learned that I wish I had learned in business school. The other thing was sales that I didn't learn in business school, but and very related, of course.
Yeah.
But I had a mentor who taught me how to run a meeting, and
Okay.
when I work with teams, one of the big feedback I get is it's not so much the feedback I get is like, "Wow, Andy, you came up with such a great line." It was that you facilitated us in a great way that helped us get to that thing,
Yeah.
and that, I mean, I really think the work that I do, it's less about me being the smarty pants who comes up with the great line, and really it's really more about aligning working to align the team around something that
Mm.
they come up with.
Yeah. There's a couple of sort of, I suppose, stories to share. But what I found quite interesting when I did my doctorate in sales was, of course, you have a huge amount of research data, and the first couple of years of doing my research, looking at a data set, and the data was really conversations. And in those days, I used to have these a wall covered it with cut out. I used to cut out all of the conversations and put them on the wall and try and
These
make
are
sense of
conversations with
with buyers.
with buyers.
Buyers,
Mhm.
yeah. So this is clients of ours inviting us to go and research how customers want to be sold to, by sellers, and then recording those conversations, and then or videoing them as we did as well. And they would use them for kickoff meetings, and stuff like that. But I was using it with their permission, of course, to actually do a deeper study of what it is that customers look for in salespeople. Anyway, the process of going through what eventually was 4 years of research, I ended up with four things, four things that customers seem to want and four things they really didn't like. And so you take out of all the complexity of all of the conversations, that process of getting down to the essence of what you think you can hear. It was something I got a huge amount of enjoyment from, but at the time you think, have I just done a 4-year research doctorate? And I've come up with four things that I think salespeople, could do. It was just,
Well,
but it was,
I relate to this in that, I had been at companies where, we do some sort of like 6-month long messaging project,
yeah,
and we'd be doing, tons of interviews, and we, tons of research, and you'd get this huge stack of stuff. And, in the end, like, you're it's still someone going through and sort of picking out stuff based on kind of what they think it should be. Of course they're
yeah,
getting signals and maybe being
yeah, yeah.
guided. um, and I was very influenced by, so when I was at Skype, I mentioned earlier, as a product manager at Skype, we they kind of got the agile religion, so I got really trained as an agile product manager, and I really carried that over into the work that I do with strategic narrative with teams. Uh, in the work that I do, we the whole engagement is about 6 to 8 weeks, but half of that is, after about 3-4 weeks, we're starting to take it out into sales calls. We're not like,
Okay.
rolling it out to the whole
Yeah.
sales team. We're starting to take it on sales calls and get a sense like, well, how is this playing? And of course we always
Okay.
learn something like, oh, some whatever phrase or whatever we thought was brilliant somehow fell flat, or
Mm-hmm.
made somebody think of something we didn't want them to think of, or there was some objection we hear a lot, and we realize, oh, we should address that up front so we don't get it. We learn a lot, but I just think like getting it out there and starting to learn as quickly as we can is
Hmm.
really, really important.
Yeah. It sounds as though you've got a very sort of well defined process and process. I'm not sure if that's the right word.
I'll take the word process. That's good.
Is that
I like it. Yeah,
okay?
I'll take it.
I hate the word process, to be honest. I'm not too much of a process person, but I've grown to love it. Well, I started off hating it, and now I've grown to love it. The bigger the
Yeah.
organization has become, but knowing that we were going to have this conversation, it also prompted me to go back to one of our master's students, who is a senior vice president of SAP, the technology company. And he works in their communications department. And he did his final dissertation on storytelling and communication. And I was listening to his podcast. It's podcast number 39, by the way, on the Sales Transformation podcast series. And one of the quotes that he came up with was, the challenge with communication is the illusion that it's taken place. I just love that quote, because as it's not exactly what, it's not looking at communication in the way that you are with strategic narrative, but I just found it quite an interesting kind of quote. But he also was inspired by someone that gave a talk at one of the big Gartner conferences, I think it was. I may have got this chap's surname wrong, but he introduced himself to the big audience and said, you guys would never have heard of me, but I'm the guy that writes all the stories for Toy Story and, the Pixar, kind of big movies. And my job is to make people cry, the emotion, through the way the story is actually told. And so this master student, a bit like you, was kind of influenced by his research into how narratives, he was just looking at the written word, how sort of create emotion. And I wonder whether that's whether partly what you get to with the steps that you go through is to try and find a way of creating a narrative that customers would have some sort of emotional affinity to. And I said, my question is that correct? Is that
it is
something
correct, and it is correct, but you get to a challenge that I came to early on. Well, there's a few things I'll address here, but one is, what do we even mean by it's emotional? Like, how do we define? Like, obviously, I don't think we're looking to make the buyer cry in the sales situation, right? So it's a different kind of emotion. So what do we even mean by that? And I think what we mean by that is what I talked about around the stakes, around the winning and losing, which is, does the buyer, because when we come to most buyers, we come to, as I think a lot of people, I'm guessing you or others have said this on this podcast in one of the previous episodes, the biggest competition is the status quo. And what that means is, in the person's head, kind of like Luke in Star Wars, when Obi-Wan first asked him, they're basically, we say we want to sell to the buyer to the pain, but actually this buyer, most of the buyers, they're not literally in pain. Like, they have their ups and downs, but they're basically going to assume they're basically okay, and they're going to assume they're always going to be okay. This, to me, is the definition of the unemotionally engaged buyer. This is what I came to. That's Luke at the beginning of Star. He's willing. He's just going to keep going. If we can tell this story about this shift this shift in the world, and we can tie it to life and death as close as we can to life and death stakes. It might be life and death of your company, or in this case. Then we get that buyer to see that, to really see that, then to feel that way, to view their future not as kind of, hey, it's going to be more of the same, but hey, I'm either going to be dead or I'm going to be like thriving. I'm going to see it in this split. That is the definition of emotionally engaged. And so that's always what we're going for. The other part, you mentioned that this first comment, the challenge with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. I learned a lot about this from Chris Voss, this negotiation guy. And he talks a lot about labeling in your response. So the other person in his case, he's the FBI hostage negotiator. So he's talking to the captor, but we could just call it the buyer. The buyer is saying things, and you want to say things back to them, like, hey, so I think what you're saying is this, and then you want to get a that's right from them. In the same way, when and by the way, I don't know if you know Chris Orlob from Gong and other places now.
I don't.
So Chris writes a lot about this. He recently wrote about this, using this shift in the world that I talk about in Discovery. So after I present the shift in the world, and I think Chris does this too, have the team say, hey, am I off base that this is showing up in your world? So we want to get them to talk about, wow, I'm at Ford, let's say, and Zuora is selling me on this, and they're telling me about this subscription economy. I want to hear that person from Ford say, our head of product now is talking about a subscription offering for our cars. And it's, it's going to be different from leases in this way. And we don't know how we're going to do it, because how we're going to do, we want to hear stuff like that. And this is going to give us a sense that we have gotten that emotional engagement. Usually I think a lot of salespeople know it intuitively. Like we see the nods, we get the person talking, all those things. We don't have to see tears.
Yeah. Yes, I've always been slightly concerned about the word pain, because I'm not sure that that necessarily that's a positive way to necessarily describe a purchasing, the reason why someone might want to purchase something.
Again, I talk about it in terms of we don't define pain or whatever in any kind of without context. The context is shift in the world, goal state in that new game, and then what are the obstacles to getting to that goal state? That's how I talk about it, and then how are we going to overcome them?
Do you? I mean, the tools are only as good as the people that are using them, right? So, you've crafted this amazing sort of strategic narrative, but you've got other people now sort of using it. It's a bit like giving someone a tennis racket. If someone is Djokovic, they're probably going to use that tennis racket really well, but, give it to me and I don't think I'd use it quite as well. So to what extent do you find, that the strategic narrative gets lost in translation? How about that? Yeah. Could it be lost in translation, meaning that, the people using it, the salespeople or the leaders that are communicating, internally, with this tool deck? To what extent do you address the kind of user?
Well, this question I think has a bunch of aspects. One way to look at it is teams I've worked with, where I've worked with the CEO and leadership team, and then how does it get propelled into the rest of the organization? And the other is teams I've never worked with. Maybe I'll start with that latter first. Is I get emails every day from someone somewhere in the world who has used that structure that I laid out. So I wrote this post called "The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen." And it really is a breakdown of those five pieces.
Is that the 1.5 million downloads you got?
Actually, I think that might just be medium. LinkedIn has like another million so it's somewhere around 3 million. That's
amazing. I know. I want our listeners to know this. This is something that so many people have downloaded, so you've got to take a look at it.
So every day someone tells me that they've used this thing. And sometimes I'll work with CEOs, or so for instance, I just got a call from a CEO the other day. He's like, "Hey, we're at the stage now where I think we're ready to engage you." And I'll say like, "Hey, I want you to read my post that explains my my
Yeah.
thing. And he said, "Oh no, I read that a long time. We've been building our decks and everything based on that for years." So,
Okay.
so I
Okay.
hear a lot of people using it.
That's great.
There definitely are a few sort of common pitfalls I see people fall
Yeah.
into sometimes when
Yeah.
sometimes they'll say, "I tried it, didn't work." And then I'll
Oh,
I'll ask them
okay.
to sometimes I'll ask them to send it to me, and I'll see sort of like what they did.
Yeah.
One thing, well, one common thing early on, especially, was they would just kind of the Zora deck is available online. They would kind of like just take the Zora deck and put their own logo on it, so they wouldn't really
Oh,
sort of
okay.
and then they sort of change whatever words, sort of whatever, to their industry. And I mean,
Yeah.
I don't put it out there as a template, like a sales deck template. It's really principles. I like to call it
Right.
for building something. But one thing that'll happen often is they'll talk about this shift in the world, and they'll say the world has changed, and then they'll say, "Hey, used to be," and they'll say old way, and then they'll list like 5 or 6 different qualities of the old way, and then the new
Yeah.
way, and they'll list like 5 or 10 different things of the new way. And I think it's really critical that we name the old and new way in the way that I've given you before, so that we have something to talk about. There's a whole movement around category creation, and the way this strategic narrative, this old game, new game, the new game, you could really call this a kind of category definition, because whatever the solution is for this new game, that's the category. But the way I like to think about it instead is as the movement that we're creating. We're championing
Right.
a movement toward this new game. It's category. It's like, okay, does Gartner recognize your category? I don't know. And a lot of companies, even
Hmm.
like Salesforce, like they were a CRM. They didn't create that category, but they created this movement to the cloud. And
Yeah.
so I think you can you can have this movement be very successful without actually it being category. Sometimes it is bonus, great. So anyway, naming that new game and the old game, not just saying, "Hey, things have changed," which I
Yeah.
started to see a lot. Um, you also asked, then the other half of that question was, when I work with a team, I work with the CEO and these leaders, like I talked about, how does it spread? And that's one reason I picked the sales deck, is because especially the teams I work with are all enterprise sales companies with big sales teams, and this, I think, is the primary channel that everybody's going to be talking through. So that's a big
Mm.
reason I chose it, because if it's just marketing that's building some story and telling it at conferences, and sales is building their own thing, it's never going to go that way. But I think it's
Hmm.
much more likely that if we're telling this story in sales and it's working, marketing can then say, "Okay, I'm going to tell that story everywhere." And that has seemed to work. Some CEOs actually do certifications. This is a big Benioff thing. I
Mm.
think everybody at the company, not even just people in sales, has to be able to present the sales deck.
Right.
And I've seen a team I just worked with recently. This team is in Ireland, that
Hmm.
big company, but they're doing that same thing with the new narrative.
Yeah. What I find uh, encouraging also about what you've just said is the fact that you sort of focus at the sales side of things, and then maybe marketing plays a role after that. Does it? Or
Oh yeah, and I think
or do
marketing. Well, always, as I said, like the marketing leader is usually a very crucial person in
okay
crafting this story. So
in
we're not
crafting? Yeah.
crafting this sales deck, apart from marketing.
Yeah.
So marketing is playing a role in that, but yes, once it's baked, now marketing can start telling that story everywhere, and probably maybe has the bigger role in disseminating it.
Yeah. So interesting. That's fantastic. So, is there anything that we haven't, sort of shared or talked about, Andy, that you feel like, or any question I haven't asked you that you think would be a good question to ask you to kind of articulate even more? I mean, you've done a very good job so far, but is there anything I've missed?
Um, Not that I can think of. Do you want to ask why? Well, some people ask why I have my mother on my podcast when I
Your
interview CEOs. So I have my own podcast. It's called The Bigger
Okay.
Narrative. Would you like to
Okay.
hear about my mother and why she
Yes,
produces
please.
my
Yeah.
episodes?
What, your mother actually does the introduction, does
She
she?
does. So what happens is I interview the CEO that I worked with. So for instance, I mentioned Nick Hernandez from 360 Learning. I interview him about our work together, and he talks about this upskill within all the new narrative we got to, and all
Okay.
the work. And then I send the conversation. I edit the conversation. I send it to my mother. She listens
Okay.
to it, and then I call her and ask her to just tell me what she thinks people are going to get out of it, like what she got out of it or
Oh,
whatever.
okay.
And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
that conversation bemes the intro to the episode. And
Ah.
I found that it was a good way for people to get into it because she'll just sort of summarize it in a way that I might make it sound uh,
She
highfalutin or
brings it down
whatever.
to earth.
She very much gets down to earth.
That's interesting. I'm just wondering whether your mother would like to do the introduction to this podcast. Do you think she would
She's
be interested?
I don't want to, tout her too much.
Burden.
She's a minor celebrity on LinkedIn. I would say
Is
she has a little bit
she?
of a
Oh
following, so
God.
it might be a waiting list, but
Oh, okay.
she very
How
well could be
amazing.
available.
Oh, golly. Well, I'll let Eddie cross
Reach out.
that
Okay,
bridge.
sounds good.
Yeah, or to reach out. How fun. Yeah, so that is amazing. How nice you involve your mother in it as well. I think that gives a very sort of personal human
It's
touch
really
to it
nice.
all.
I mean,
It's really
my
nice.
folks
Yeah.
are definitely getting up there in years, and to have them sort
Right.
of connected to my work in that way is
I
really, really
know.
fun.
Yeah, that's
Um,
fantastic.
yeah,
I love
yeah.
it. Love it. What a great idea. Brilliant. Well, Andy, thanks so much, for taking part in our sales transformation podcast. I know that Eddie is going to provide details to your, website and links and things like that, but I found it really, really interesting.
Yeah, me too. Thanks.
Yes.
It was a great. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed
Yeah.
talking with you.